All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to Out of Spec Guide. I'm Max, and I'm joined today by my dad, who's in the car with me. Hey, Dad.
Hi there.
So you're visiting Colorado from the state of Maine in the Northeast, right?
That's right.
Yep. Nice to having you visit, and I want to film a quick video today where you are like a not intentional EV Luddite, but just a normal person who hasn't driven. I don't. Have you been in an electric car at all?
Uh, you know what? This may be the first purely electric car I've been in.
Okay, so this is your reaction to being in an electric car, but also three kind of interesting questions and concerns that you brought up that I feel like are broadly representative of what people generally ask about electric cars who are, concerned, have doubts about them, not so sure. So I know many of you watching this channel are EV enthusiasts, or you have some kind of stake in this, or you are curious yourself. Maybe some of you have some of these questions. I think this will be a good way of me addressing them, you just asking me your biggest questions about what is going on with electric cars.
Okay, well, first off, I think this is a pretty fancy car.
Yeah, it's my Polestar 2, and I enjoyed it a lot. I got a great used deal on it, and I know right off the bat the car being quiet kind of freaked you out, right?
Yes, that does freak me out about all electric cars. I think they're kind of creepy. That, how they creep up on you, it just seems unnatural.
Yeah, they do. Some of them make fake noise, or they all are required to make at least some kind of threshold of noise for pedestrian safety. But yes, much quieter than a gas car. And Dad, you drive, by the way, like a big, VW Atlas SUV with a VR6 engine, not particularly EV vehicle hybrid of any kind. So with EVs, with batteries, with everything, with electric cars, I know you have like three big questions and concerns. What's your first?
Well, I guess the first one would have to do with whether or not, I live in Maine, which is a cold state. So I hear sometimes these batteries freeze in the winter. If I had an electric car, I wouldn't want to come out and not be able to use it because it was frozen on a cold day.
Well, I'll just say that's not true. They don't freeze in winter. If anything, an electric car is going to start easier in the cold than a combustion car that has to heat up an engine and get catalytic reactions going and stuff. So it's not going to freeze. That said, cold weather does affect batteries, and modern electric cars have to heat the batteries so the batteries behave well in the cold, and they all have systems for doing this. So the only situation in which an electric car, wouldn't turn over, to so to speak, or start in the cold, would be the battery was so low that the car couldn't heat its battery to be used. But most cars, even when you leave them parked and offline, so to speak, they're gonna make sure, if let's say they're parked outside and it's cold in Maine during winter, they're actually going to actively turn on heaters and keep the battery warm so long as they have charge.
And those heaters aren't going to take up even more battery.
They do take up battery. And so this is a thing where if you left an electric car out for not days, but like a couple of weeks on end in cold weather, especially if it was at a low state of charge, like 20% to begin with, yes, then you're in trouble. You're risking the long-term health of the battery. And worst case, you end up in a situation where you go to unlock the car and it's fully dead.
So it's possible it could be a problem, but just not very possible.
Not very possible, especially for a lot of people who are getting electric cars. They're going to have some kind of home charger solution, or they're going to charge, somewhat frequently, because most people wouldn't be comfortable, I think, parking at home with less than 30% battery on a regular basis. So as long as you're using your car somewhat regularly, you have a way of charging it at home, whether you leave it plugged in overnight or you just leave it above 30-40%, give it a comfortable buffer. Electric cars nowadays are smart in managing their battery and making sure it's not going to, become an issue where when you started the battery was super cold. Because if the battery was super cold and they didn't manage it when you started it, then yes, the car could have, acceleration that wouldn't be what you want, and it would struggle to charge quickly, all of those things. But Dad, there is a concern in the cold where they lose a lot of range because, like you said, right, they use battery to heat themselves. The energy doesn't come for free. As a result, EV owners in states like Colorado here and, EV owners in your state of Maine would notice that, yeah, my car actually appreciably loses range in winter. It's still going to drive perfectly well, but because it has to heat up all of that battery metal, instead of getting, let's say, 250 miles of range, you could get appreciably less, like 20% less. You're down to like 200 miles in winter, or even lower.
Okay. Well, what about these invoices that I've seen for people who had to replace their batteries, and it's like $50,000?
Yeah, so I don't know about the exact cost of that, but it's absolutely true that batteries are expensive in an EV. In fact, a battery is probably the most expensive single component. In some cases, estimates put them at around 40% of the price of the car, depending on what it is. Huge, huge inconvenience if you had to replace your battery. So, if early electric cars like the Nissan Leaf, which used more kind of basic cooling systems and battery management systems, did have issues where their batteries would degrade within the lifetime of the car. Like owners in, let's say, a hot state like Florida or Texas with a Nissan Leaf would notice that their battery would degrade appreciably. They'd lose a lot of range after like 4 or 5 years if they left their car parked and it was hot and all of those things. Nowadays, batteries, like I told you, right, they can heat themselves, they will cool themselves actively, so the battery degradation is not so much of a concern. It absolutely happens, and after 10 years, I think most electric car batteries, if they're used a lot, will degrade. But we're seeing Teslas with 100, and 50,000 miles, and at this point, right, a decade of ownership and daily use that are doing fine. They might get 15% less range than they had when they were new, but so long as the battery is at above 80% or such health, the car is still going to behave predictably. It's still useful, and I would argue, Dad, for most cars, 10 years is close to really the lifetime use of the vehicle. Now, Elon Musk and some people have even made statements saying, oh, batteries could go millions of miles if actively managed, and we don't really have the anecdotal or the evidence we would want to see in enough cars to prove that's the case. Maybe it's theoretically possible, but what I can safely say, Dad, is that for most owners, the battery is not going to be a concern for the lifetime of the car, and most brands give a big warranty on the battery compared to the rest of the car. Like, let's say they have a 1 year, right, full maintenance schedule or full warranty for all the components of the car. For the battery and the powertrain, they tend to have like 8 to 10 year warranties.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess finally my question would be, all these people say these electrical cars are environmentally friendly, more so than combustion engines. But if we're not competing with the Chinese for the battery metals in Africa, we're going to have to mine them at home. What do people think about that?
Well, if anything, I think for the U.S. specifically, that's kind of where we want to be. Because if we want to be like the same way we've achieved energy independence right now with fracking and stuff is environmentally fraught as that is, I think most people from a national security point of view or U.S. citizens would say that's a good thing, right? So with EVs, if we're going to build EVs at a mass scale, we probably want the minerals and the resources to be mined, processed, refined, and used here, right? So we're finding that there's lots of resources in the U.S. We're blessed in that way. However, environmentally managing all of that, harvesting them, that's difficult. And
Western Maine, where Sunday River is, that's a potential mining site.
Yeah. And I imagine, right, in areas like that, there's some degree of NIMBYism of people not wanting huge-scale mining operations in their backyard.
Well, we also want economic development. I mean, we need jobs, so that's another issue.
Yeah. So there's promise here, and there's also threats, and I'm not going to pretend to be a full expert on the battery supply chain and minerals. And the reality is, when you're building any kind of, several thousand pounds of metal and sitting on 4 wheels of rubber, these vehicles take lots of resources to make, electric cars being no exception. And yeah, they actually take more resources from like a carbon emissions point of view to assemble than a gas car. That said, multiple studies have borne out that over time driving them, because they're zero emissions, depending on, of course, the cleanliness of your grid, how quick it is, they do offset and eventually start being a net benefit because they're zero emissions. So even if you had a dirty grid, after a while of driving an electric car, it could be months, maybe a couple of years, you would find that it, at that point, zeroes out in terms of carbon emissions. And then if you have a cleaner grid, that could be even quicker. So it's... I'm not going to pretend it's not a concern. It's absolutely something I think we need to do to keep these companies, the auto companies themselves and their suppliers accountable in terms of how they're sourcing these minerals. And the reality is not all of them are going to be sourced in the U.S. Some of them are going to have to be sourced by trading partners or from countries like China and areas that China controls in terms of mining. They just control a lot of a lot of resources for batteries. So I don't want to get, political or partisan necessarily in this discussion, but I would say that, like, I think the U.S. take EVs seriously. The people in this industry who are experts realize that we have to do a lot of this work ourselves, and we have to do it cleanly. And if we're gonna, preach what we or practice what we preach, so it's an absolutely, I think, great concern you bring up, Dad. It's one I don't have all the answers to right now, but it's one that I'm broadly optimistic about, because even, like, to get to your earlier question about, like, what happens when we replace the batteries. There's end-of-life potential for reusing batteries from electric cars in energy storage applications, or there's companies like Redwood Industries, I believe, who are recycling batteries and finding ways to basically reuse the minerals that make them up. So we're finding ways to kind of make the cradle-to-gate impact of EVs lower. That being said, it's substantial and it exists, and it's worth bringing that up.
You mentioned national security. I got one more question. What if there's a thermonuclear event, like a strike? Then none of these cars are going to work, and we're going to need the combustion engines again.
You mean like an EMP, like an electromagnetic pulse or something?
Correct.
Well, the reality is, Dad, gas cars are electric starting, so they would be impacted too. They also run on low voltage 12-volt batteries. So that's a little bit more of a far out concern, but I feel like we'd have larger problems on our hands in that event.
Okay. All right. Well, something to think about.
Yeah. Well, always appreciate your concerns, Dad. And before we close out the video, we're in my Polestar 2, of course. We've been driving for a little bit. Any other kind of impressions as we've been cruising along that you have of being in an EV for what it sounds like is the first time?
Well, it seems pretty normal, other than the not making any noise.
Yeah. So quiet-ish.
A lot of gadgetry.
Yeah.
Quite a screen there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the interior of this vehicle. A lot of EVs, right? They really like to emphasize the high-tech nature of it. Though I'm hoping, frankly, to see more options that are just simpler for users and maybe less complicated from a technological point of view, so that they're cheaper and also less intimidating to people who like physical controls and things like that. Like you said, this car, a Tesla, lots of those cars have lots of screens. But anyhow, it's really nice on this channel to get a perspective from a normal person. So thanks, Dad.
A Luddite.
I said you're not a Luddite at the beginning of this video.
Kinda.
Okay, maybe a little bit, but a lot of people are like you, and I think it's really useful to have your perspective. So thanks for bearing with me and filming this with me and kind of lending your take on EVs and some of the concerns you have, because I don't think they should be outright, dismissed. I think your thermonuclear war situation's a little far-fetched, but the rest of your questions I think are really great points. So hopefully that's helpful to people who are watching this.
Thanks for the ride.
See you next time. Bye.